Hello, my name is John Cogley, and I'm the owner of Daniel Smith Artist Materials out of Seattle, Washington, USA. Today what I'm going to do is go over what it is we have and what it is that we offer in the watercolor line. And I'm going to go over the story of how we make paint, which I find to be very, very interesting. Minerals and what minerals bring to you as an artist, and also how to read a watercolor chart. So I'll start with how we make paint and what makes us very different. We started 47 years ago in Seattle, Washington. We've been making watercolor paint for about the last 24 years. The Primatech line is part of our 252 watercolors, and you can see behind me, these are the watercolors. There's 252, and I'll be explaining these today. A portion of that line, 35 of them, are these Primatechs. And what makes the Primatechs very, very exciting is that they granulate. And this is what granulation is. You can see this effect right here. If you were in chemistry, this would be called flocculation. It can be called reticulation or granulation. And it really comes down because the specific gravity is different within the mineral, and light things go to the top and heavy things go to the bottom of the paper like a river, causes granulation. This is in difference, for example, to a quinacridone, which is a absolutely perfect pigment. It's the same weight, it's the same size, it's the same shape, therefore there's no granulation. Many of the colors that we have were made for the car industry, and the car industry doesn't want to have any type of granulation because they would have recalls. I always like to say they're perfect in their imperfection. So in starting off, again, my name is John Cogley. I've been in Daniel Smith for 30 years. I bought the entire company about 9 years ago. It's a phenomenal place. We get our pigments from two places. We get them from the earth and we get them from the laboratory. From the laboratory, they're called synthetic. And that's just because it's things that don't generally want to behave in the natural world together. And in the laboratory, we can force them to be together. And those would be things like perylines, pyrroles, quinacridones, etc. Quite beautiful, beautiful colors. Throughout time, humans have tried to express themselves with color. We find that in France, in the caves. We can find that in South America with the Incans and the Mayans. We can find that in Africa, Australia, and certainly in the US. So wherever there's been people, there has been this need to express themselves, and that's done by coloring the natural world. This is a great example right here. This is Minnesota Pipestone, and Minnesota Pipestone comes from Minnesota, USA, and it was used to make the peace pipes, or pipes that the native Indians would use. And it's also found in South America, but it's not indigenous to South America. So the neat things that minerals can show us is also trade routes between peoples and between civilizations. These two minerals right here, one of these is tiger's eye, and tiger's eye is used quite prominently in making rings and making cabochons as necklaces. One thing that I do with it is we put it into an oven, a furnace. We increase the heat of the furnace to about 600 degrees Fahrenheit, and we change the oxidation state. So when something's magnetic, as tiger's eye is magnetic, having iron, we can actually change that and cause it to be burnt tiger's eye or red tiger's eye, which then changes how the pigment looks and how the color looks. Another very nice mineral is serpentine, and this particular serpentine right here comes from Tasmania. It's a beautiful, beautiful color. You can see the granulation. You can see the nuances and differences between the pigment itself. You know, right in here, it's the stitchite. It's kind of a purplish, whereas the rest of the material is this greenish color. And you can see both of it right here in this wash. Processing minerals is an art. The way that we process these particular minerals, many of them start out about the size of a watermelon. And they're put into what's called a jaw mill. And a jaw mill will slightly squeeze the mineral, And because minerals have their crystals, they have lattices, they very easily cleave or come apart. So I could put something the size of a watermelon into this jaw mill. It just slightly squeezes and it'll come out about the size of this. I then put this into what's called a hammer mill. The hammer mill will take this and then the size will come out about the size of a piece of rice. I then put it to what's called a ball mill, very similar to your dryer that tumbles and tumbles and tumbles. And what I'm eventually looking for is a material that's about 40 microns. And to understand 40 microns, this piece of paper thickness right here is about 100 microns. The magic of 40 microns is that the human eye can't differentiate the particle size if it's under 40 microns. I'm always asked, well, John, why don't you just crush the mineral? If you crushed it, it would be so much faster. And a good example of why I don't do that is looking at table sugar. If I take a cup of table sugar and I bring it to the window and I move it around, it's alive. I see blues and golds and greens. It actually dances, and that's because the crystal is not destroyed. If I go back and I get a cup of icing sugar, powdered sugar, and bring that to the same window and move it, it's deader than a doornail. So the whole part about being able to have mineral pigments is not destroying the crystal. So Primatech is prima from primitive and tech because of technology. In coming up with this, I really thought about the native Plains Indians and what they would do. They would go to riverbeds, for example, and they'd find siennas and ochres, etc., and they would crush those up best they could, put those into an animal fat, and then wear that on their face or put that on their ponies as war paint or as decoration. Ponies and people don't last very long, so therefore when they pass away, that really isn't carried forward. Whereas in Alaska, where it was put on totem poles, you can still see the very vibrant blues and yellows and reds even today. So once I have the pigment, it becomes time to make the paint itself. And that's done in steps which are very similar to cooking. I will get a vessel, which is a pot, and inside of that I'll put distilled water, I'll put the pigment, and I'll put the gum arabic. I use distilled water, and we use distilled water in our processing because it doesn't have any other materials inside of it. I will then mix that in a very large mixer. You may have on your table a mixer that's a foot high. These are 16 to 20 foot tall mixers. And they mix very, very, very quickly, and they create what's called a vortex, which is air, similar to if you had an egg beater and you were mixing a cake mix. You'll see it all of a sudden grow very quickly inside of your mixing pot because you're putting air into the mixture. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put gum arabic around each particle. If I don't do that, because the particles are so small, again, they're 40 microns, they're less than half the thickness of this piece of paper right here. They're so small, they have an electrostatic charge and they want to stick together. If they do that, I get what's called an agglomerate. An agglomerate, when light hits it differentially. A wave will come down, it'll go that way. A wave will come down, it'll go that way. It's called scattering of light. And in scattering of light, I get both hot spots and cold spots. The artist can see that very quickly within their own paintings. They can look and say, I wonder why this particular area is lighter or darker than the rest of the area. And that's a hot spot or cold spot. By making sure that we can put gum arabic around each particle, it becomes more linear. And so when light hits it, I get uniform refraction. One, it gives me maximum brightness, and it also gives me the same color across the paint. The next step that we use in our processing is called a dispersion mill. And a dispersion mill does two things. One, it gets rid of the air that I just put into the mixture by mixing it. And two, it causes the agglomerate to be ripped apart. Having two rolls that move in opposition to each other creates a tearing effect over and over. So when this agglomerate comes through, it's ripped apart. And now the next time it comes through, the gum arabic can go around each particle, allowing it to lay out linearly. When that's done, the next step in my process is putting it within a tube, and then the most important piece is getting that tube, of course, to the end artist. There's a couple of machines that we use. One of them is extremely important to me in my production. It's called a Xenon fadeometer. And what a Xenon fadeometer is, it's about the size of a refrigerator. And it has a bulb that's about 1.5 to 2 feet long, and it's very, very thick, and it's hollow in the middle, and I push distilled water down the center of it. If I didn't do that, the bulb would actually melt. It gets that hot. And with a Xenon fadeometer, in 4 days, I can do 100+ years of light. So I light fast test everything that we make. That assures that when you get it, you can have a guarantee that if I say it lasts 100+ years, it lasts 100+ years. So this is an example of particle size. And right here we have a salt crystal and a piece of human hair that's been cut. This is 40 microns, and what I'm looking for when I'm processing these minerals into pigment, it's extremely small. And let me show you kind of why that's important. This is Ultramarine, and this is French Ultramarine. These are both PB29, pigment blue number 29, PB29. And I'm asked quite a bit, John, what's the difference between French Ultramarine and Ultramarine? And the difference is, because they're the same pigment, is particle size. The French Ultramarine has a slightly larger particle size, so when light comes down and hits it, it moves toward the warm or the red. Because Ultramarine has a smaller particle size, when light comes down and hits that, it moves toward the cool. So this is an example of why particle size matters. These are very, 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 very small particles. One's about 6 microns, one might be around 10 microns, which again, thinking about this being 100 microns, they're incredibly small. But even that small difference between the two particle sizes causes one to be warm and one to be cool. Again, the French Ultramarine is the warm shade because a larger particle, and the Ultramarine is slightly cooler because of a smaller particle. In addition, if we look at this picture right here, this is Quinacridone. And Quinacridone means 5 rings. This particular one is PV19, which means pigment violet number 19. This is a situation in which the chemical structure can change a color. So again, I'm asked quite a bit, if I knew the PV19, can I go to somebody else and would their color look the same? And the answer to that is no. And I'll show you what I mean by that. This is PV19, which is Quinacridone violet number 19. This is PV19. It's Quinacridone rose. So Quinacridone violet, Quinacridone rose, both PV19. And this is Quinacridone red, PV19. So these 3 colors, all PV19, do not look the same. And that's because PV19 kind of gets you in the general area. It doesn't tell you the shade. And because these have different alpha and beta particles on the ring structure, they actually have a different shade and therefore a different color that we see. So this is a difference because of size of the particle, and this is a difference because of chemistry. Size matters, chemistry matters. So what I'm going to be showing here is the different types of granulation in 4 different watercolors. And it's a really beautiful process to not only hear about, but actually do yourself so it's tactile. We call this putting paint to paper. And it's something that if I was doing a presentation, I'd be asking you to do so you can actually feel it yourself. So this first one right here is Cascade Green. What I like about Cascade Green is how it breaks out. So I'm going to do just a small watercolor line here. And I'm going to put some Cascade Green into it. Need to be a little patient. As an American, I'm not real patient, but need to be a little bit patient. And we'll put some here And we'll put some here. Some more here. Some more here. And if I wait, and there I didn't wait long enough myself, if I wait, I can start seeing some yellows break out with my green because it granulates very, very quickly. I'll just do a bigger blob so you can see it. Again, it's better when you're patient. There we go. And it'll start to break out. So we'll let that one break out a little bit. And this next one is Lunar Black. Lunar Black is very interesting in that it's a single pigment black. And normally you would not expect a single pigment to granulate because all the particles are the same size and they're the same weight, so there's nothing that would have them granulate out. But Lunar Black, it does granulate because the particles are so small. It's very similar to that putting some very fine pepper on water and you can see it crack and come apart. Same principles here. The particles are so small, they don't want to be with each other. Very, very interesting. But this is what Lunar Black looks like. If you lay it out, and again, you want to use plenty of water, it'll start to granulate. We can see the granulation happening really quickly right in here, and right in here, and right in here. It's very, very quick. So again, this process, you can see how quick it's happening, almost instantaneously. You can see it very, very quickly in here. And now back to the Cascade Green, we can see some of the yellow and the green here. Granulation will happen no matter what. So even if I used hot press paper, which has no tooth to it, it's just smooth, you're still gonna get granulation, but it'll be more radial in its effect. But no matter what, if something granulates, it's gonna granulate. So this next one is an example of moon glow. And moon glow is anthracenoid red, viridian, and ultramarine blue. So I have 3 different pigments in one matrix. And let's look what that does. And that's a highly granulating color as well. We'll let it out some with water here. But you can watch right here. You can see it granulating very, 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 very quickly. And the last one is the Primatech. So this is made from the mineral. And I'll show you how fast that one does too. And so you can see in here how quickly it's going to start to granulate. Very similar to up here. If I let this out, the more I do it, and wait a couple, 30, 40 seconds, you can see how fast now it's granulating. So highly granulating colors, both the Primatech, this one right here being a synthetic made up of 3 different pigments, anthracenoid red, ultramarine blue, and viridian. Lunar Black, single pigment synthetic, and then the Cascade Green. One question I do get asked is, how many colors can I mix before I get mud? And John, in particular, when it comes to something as Moonglow or Shadow Violet, which has 3 pigments, it's made of 3 pigments. Well, because this is made of 3 pigments and we put those pigments together dry, and then we mix the dry pigment and put that dry pigment then into gum arabic, it's the same as 1 color. So you can actually use something as Moonglow and mix it with 2 other colors and still not get mud. But this is granulation, so you can see really now, really seeing the granulation here, really seeing the granulation here, seeing the granulation in here, and seeing the separation that you want to have with the Cascade Green right in here. Right in here, I see the yellowish tint as the paint is coming apart in its 2 pigments. It's the way it was made to do, the same as you can see up here in the swatch. What I'm going to be going over right now is how to read a color chart. One of the most useful things I believe a watercolorist can have as a tool in their toolbox is how to read a color chart. What this allows you to do, instead of just picking up any color, it's to know over a cup of coffee, for example, what colors you're going to use, and why you're going to use them. So let's go over how we do that. As I open up the Daniel Smith color chart, I'm going to see a couple of things. First, I'm going to see the general colors, which I'll go over with you. On the back, I'm going to see the Primatechs and also the Luminescents. So we'll deal with each one of these. So where I'm going to start is I'm going to start with buff titanium. And this is what buff titanium looks like. That's buff titanium right there. So buff titanium is either buff titanium or it's a raw titanium. If we look right here, we can see the general name buff titanium. Underneath that, what it's available in. This is available in a 15 mil, a 5 mil, or stick format. Underneath that, I see 4 different letters and symbols. There's a key down here we're going to be going over in a moment. The last thing we see is actually the pigment. In this case, it's PW6:1. P is always for pigment. So what this is saying is pigment white, pigment W, P white, pigment white number 6, shade number 1. If just for a second we go down here and we look at processed titanium, we can see that titanium white is PW6. So that :1, that shade, is what differentiates it in color from just titanium, which is a very bright white, to buff titanium, which is a very, very, very off. It's a very useful color. So let's go over some of the characteristics of buff titanium. First, we see there's a 1, and the Roman numeral 1 actually refers to light fastness. We see it's 1 for excellent, and that's for 100+ years. So it means in our light fast testness machine, the Xenon photometer, we've tested this out to 100+ years. The next is 1 again, and that's for whether it stains or doesn't stain. A 1 means that it's non-staining. If I take a wet brush and I put that wet brush, even now that this is dry, I can actually pick up this paint because this is non-staining. A 2 means that it's lightly staining. So lightly staining might mean that I see down in here a very, 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 very light tint. If it's a 3, which means more staining, I might see something in this range over here. And 4, it's going to be just like I put it down. It's not going to move. I'm not going to be able to pick it up. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 non-staining, 4 completely staining. The next is either a yes or a no. And it's a Y if it granulates, and N if it doesn't granulate. And the reason that we put that there is if you use a granulating color with a non-granulating color, you're going to get some aspect of that granulation coming over to the non-granulating color. The last is for opacity. And in this case, buff titanium, we see half the circle is filled. That means it's semi-transparent. If it were fully open, that means it'd be transparent. If it were fully dark, that would mean it would be opaque. So over a cup of coffee, knowing what these symbols now mean, I can choose which colors I might want to pick. So let's look at another one. This one here is called Quinacridone yellow. And I'm asked quite a bit, how do you get these strange names? Why isn't this called raincoat yellow? And the reason is I have chemists that work for me. I have 3 chemists. And when you have chemists, you have people like engineers that want standards. So it's a naming structure. And the way the naming structure is this. If it's a single pigment, the name of the person that made it, that found it, that came up with it, we use their name. So if I had a daughter and her name was Mary, you'd call my daughter Mary, even though you might think a better name was Charlotte. Because I'm the creator, you'd call it that name. Same principle here. A chemist or a company, because of the single pigment, called it quinacridone, and so we're going to call it quinacridone. If it's a mix, i.e. it has more than one pigment, and a good example of that might be Moonglow. My chemist named this particular color Moonglow because it has 3 pigments. There's Viridian, there's Ultramarine blue, and there's Anthraquinoid red. And my chemist put those together, and because it's 3 pigments, it's more than one, he named it Moonglow. So more than one pigment, you can call it whatever it is you want to call it. One pigment, you defer to the person that created it. This is another example. This is Sleeping Beauty. And people often ask me, does this come from a Disney movie? And I say, no. Sleeping Beauty, the way that this is named is turquoise from Turkey was found. So we call it turquoise. And then Sleeping Beauty, because this comes from the Sleeping Beauty mine located in Arizona. So Sleeping Beauty mine located in Arizona, USA, turquoise. Sleeping Beauty turquoise. So that's how a naming structure works. If we turn this over, we can see the Primatechs, and we already discussed that. Primatech meaning primitive technology. And down here we have what's called the Luminescent. And the Luminescent series, for the most part, are colors that have mica in them. They're very prevalent within the car industry. It gives your car that sparkle that you see, and it comes in several different flavors. The first flavor is what's called a pearlescent. And a pearlescent you can add to your paint to give it a sparkle. And here's the two different sparkle. This is in shimmer and this is in white. So let me show you how that looks, and that's how it looks. Okay. This is over a black and this is over just the paper itself. So you can see how it would react over a very light or a very dark color. It's certainly going to pop when it comes onto a dark color. Okay, that's pearlescent, part of the luminescent family. The next is what's called an iridescent, and we have many different iridescents. And let me show you what an iridescent looks like. So this is an Aztec gold iridescent, and you can see how it pops over the dark. You can see it on the white, it really pops over the dark. And that's kind of how it looks. Very, very, very popular are the iridescents. The next are the interference. Interference will pop over the dark. They're very transparent over the white. Although you can see them if you move your paper, not as poppy as the iridescent over the white, but very much so similar over the dark. And then we have the duochrome. Duochrome is called duochrome for two. And what that means is you can see it's one pigment that'll pop to two different colors. So you can see it's kind of pinkish on this side, but purplish on this side. And that's just a single pigment. Give you another one. Bluish on one side, greenish on the other. So a lot of artists are using this to give the human eye, when eyes are done and the watercolor dries, it looks like a very kind of a dead eye. Whereas if you put a luminescent or a iridescent, it gives that wetness or that sparkle into the eye, which makes it look more natural, more alive. I'm asked about cadmium hues. In the front right here, we can see cad hues right here. And a hue just means it's not what's in front of it. I don't use cadmiums. It's something I moved away from years ago. The cadmium hues will give you the same opacity, and you will get the even more vibrancy from these particular colors. So compared to a cad, they're going to be as or more opaque, and they're going to be as or more vibrant without having any issues that cadmiums come from. So these are the several types of cadmium hues that Daniel Smith has. On every one of our tubes, we tell you if you turn the tube around, everything goes to a toxicologist in the US. So that person is both an MD and has a PhD either in biochemistry or chemistry. And it has to go through toxicology and come back to Daniel Smith before we would ever release it out for general usage. The health of my employees and the health of the artists that use my product are unbelievably important to me. So that's done with every single color that we have. So these are three pieces of material that I've gone over today. The first one is Daniel Smith Primatech, and it tells the story of each one of the Primatech colors. So it tells the mineral, it tells the story, and it shows you the paint out and the pigment itself. So there's 35, and it goes over the story of all 35, including the locations of where in the world that they're found. The next is the Daniel Smith story about how we make paint, and it goes over how paint is processed for the Primatechs into pigment, and then from pigment, how it's made into paint, how it's tested for light fastness, and then the different characteristics, both hardness, whether it granulates and what granulation is, and particle size. I think you'll find this very interesting. Lastly was a discussion of the Daniel Smith color chart. This is a phenomenal tool for any artist to have in their toolbox. It goes over all the information of all the colors that we make. You can find out the pigment, you can find out the specifications and the key characteristics of any color that we have, both the general colors, the Primatech colors, and the luminescent colors. All these materials are available on the SAA website, so please feel free to go and get those and look at those. I think you'll find them quite interesting. I did want to take a moment to thank you so very, very much for buying Daniel Smith and for listening to me today. I appreciate your patronage greatly.